Good morning, Year 11. So welcome to the Macbeth book group. This is for your revision for Paper 1 English Literature. So this is the text that you've chosen to look at in more detail and eventually to write an essay response on. So across the weeks we're going to be looking at the main story and the background to the story, that's the context. We'll be looking at the characters and linking those to the themes. We'll go through some past questions and then eventually you'll be asked to write your own essay response on this text. To begin, you'll need your exercise book from last year. You should have by now a copy of the text and you should have a Macbeth booklet that's got lots of different tasks in it you can use for independent revision. You should also have either a Google Doc or some lined A4 paper where you can make notes for these sessions. So let's begin. It's been such a long time since you've been seated with your teacher in the classroom, reading through this book and learning about it. I imagine you'll probably have some understanding, but I'm going to assume that you haven't remembered anything, so please don't worry if you've forgotten a lot of who the characters are and how the plot runs. In this session, we're going to be looking at the context of the play, and then we're going to look at the plot outline and how those ideas connect together. So the context are the thoughts and feelings that people had at the time that the play was written. And you can see underneath that title we have the symbol AO3. A stands for assessment, O for objective, and this is the third one. If you talk about the people's thoughts and feelings at the time in your essays, then you'll find you'll be able to pick up more marks for AO3. So the main thoughts and feelings people had were fear, ambition, cynicism and power. So let's explore that in more detail.
So let's explore life in 1606 in more detail. I've chosen this date because this is the date when the play was written. 3 years previously, Elizabeth I, who was widely loved by the community and caused expansionism of trade and wealth across the world, dies, and instead they get James VI from Scotland, who's much more of an absolutist king. He becomes the first king of England. Now, as a result of his absolute thrust for power, he has arguments with the Parliament, who become increasingly assertive, and they demand to have more power. And of course, at a time when there's so much conflict within a society, then this gives rise to belief in the supernatural, and in this case, in the 16th/17th century, witchcraft was widely believed in.
Right, so you've had a quick information burst about the thoughts and feelings of people at the time the play was written. Every time you see this little Pac-Man symbol is your chance to stop, complete a task online, which we'll find on Google Classroom, and then when you've, in this case, completed the quiz, come back to me and then you can continue the lesson. All of Shakespeare's plays fall into 5 acts, and each of the acts has a clear role. So the first act is the prologue, and the job of that act is just to introduce the characters, the setting and the mood. Often a prologue is a side scene where you might see an influence on the main action. In the case of Macbeth, the side scene is the witches. And then you have the conflict in Act 2, and this is all the build up to the problem. A problem's being presented, how is the character going to react to it, what kind of troubles and traumas do they encounter along the way. And in the case of our play, the main conflict is, should Macbeth kill the king or should he not kill the king to achieve his ambition of kingship? And so we can see the build up, and then eventually at the end of that act, the actual murder has already taken place of King Duncan. By the time we come to Act 3, we're in the rising action, so things continue in the same vein. Macbeth feels remorse, he wished he hadn't killed the king to become king himself, and then he feels anger, that he shows fear because Banquo knows what happened, and then he becomes more and more paranoid and does things like arranging the murder of Banquo and seeing the ghost of Banquo at the banquet to celebrate him becoming king. Now things get worse in Act 4, and this is where everything begins to unravel in the falling action. And this is where Macbeth is so troubled that he feels he has to return to the witches to ask for more advice, and he believes the prophecies they give him. We then switch to England, where Malcolm, the rightful heir to the throne, Duncan's son, is questioning Macduff to try and make sure that Macduff, who declares himself as a loyal member to the royal family and a patriotic member of Scotland, is actually those two things. And eventually the two men do learn to trust one another, and so we see the beginning of them being able to raise an army from England to attack Macbeth and topple him through from the throne. Now, by the time we get to Act 5, this is the denouement. And the denouement in French is where we have all the loose ends tied together. The English army arrives, Macbeth becomes more fearful, he's in denial of the prophecies, the battle begins, it ends in his ultimate death, and then the rightful heir to the throne, Malcolm, is restored. Right, so we're just going to run through the whole story here. I put some prompt words up on this screen for you, so if you want to use them in your own summary, which you're going to do in a moment, you're very welcome. Okay, so the whole story begins with a typical Shakespearean side scene. It's just three witches meddling, being mischievous, agreeing they're going to meet with Macbeth after he's fought on the battlefield. This act allows us to meet the main characters. We see Macbeth as a great hero. He's just won the battle in the name of King Duncan against the Norwegians. Next to him is his sidekick, Banquo. He's equally as heroic and successful. They're very good friends. And then we see Duncan intelligence gathering, getting lots of information about the battle to show that he is a worthy king. The words that Shakespeare uses to describe Duncan is meek and mild, so you could just jot those down too. The witch's prophecy then is the most important part of this act. The three witches meet with Macbeth and Banquo on their way back from battle, and they declare that Macbeth shall become the Thane of Cawdor. Currently he's only the Thane of Glamis, and he shall become king after that. Banquo, on the other hand, won't become king, but his sons will become king. The quote used there is, "Thou shalt get kings." Macbeth is so excited, but also troubled by the experience, that he writes a letter to his wife, and Lady Macbeth reacts to it by explaining she feels Macbeth is too cowardly to be able to kill the king. When you kill your king, you're known as committing regicide, Regicide. Regi is anything to do with king, and the side part is the murder. So Macbeth is too cowardly to commit murder of his king in order to achieve his ambition of becoming king himself. Now, as the story progresses, in Act 2 there's a lot of umming and ahhing, deciding, hallucinating, thinking, rejecting on the part of Macbeth. Should he kill the king? Shouldn't he kill the king? And already at the end of Act 1, Act 1 Scene 7, and the beginning of Act 2, Macbeth is speaking in soliloquy. This is where a character stands on the stage and they speak openly about their thoughts and feelings. We know that if a character speaks in soliloquy, we can trust their thoughts and feelings. So here there's a lot of planning and scheming for the murder, and eventually at the end of this act, Macbeth has gone into Duncan's bedchamber in Macbeth's castle. He's taken a dagger and he's repeatedly murdered the king. All we see are the reaction of the other characters to the murder the next morning. We don't see the actual act on scene, on the stage. Things get worse. The rising action takes place. Macbeth's reactions are explicitly described to the audience. First of all, he feels remorse and regret for having killed such a good king to achieve his ambition. Then he experiences fear of Banquo, because Banquo is the only person who knows what the witches have said, and therefore the motivation for the murder. Macbeth is tormented by the fact he doesn't have any sons or daughters, so there'll be no heir to his throne. He calls his throne a fruitless crown, and he becomes more and more angry and paranoid to try and make sure that Banquo's sons don't become king. But of course, Banquo's killed by the murderers that Macbeth organises, but his son Fleance isn't. Fleance flees, therefore reinforcing the fact that the prophecy can never be unchanged. To make things worse, Macbeth's guilt and paranoia are displayed through a ghost of Banquo who sits at the table that the lords and Macbeth and Lady Macbeth have to celebrate Macbeth becoming king. So this is the first time that Macbeth's strange mental state is displayed for all of the lords to see. Things begin to unravel after that. Macbeth is still going on his murderous rampage. He kills Macduff's wife and son, in fact all of his children, because he realises that Macduff is a traitor and he's trying to secure revenge. But he becomes so confused and tormented that he has to go back to the witches to ask them for further advice, and they give him 3 predictions. Beware Macduff, beware when Dunsinane reaches Burnham Wood walks and reaches Dunsinane Castle, which Macbeth thinks is ridiculous because woods can never walk, and then finally that he shall be killed. And so they're united to defeat Macbeth, both Malcolm and Macduff. Now Malcolm is the son of King Duncan and he's the rightful heir to the throne. He's run away to England with Macduff, who's a lord, who's also loyal to King Duncan, and the two of them have gone to England to try and rouse an army so they can come back and defeat the villain and the evil deed doer Macbeth. So they're determined that all of this fearful and dictatorship should be removed. By the time we get to Act 5, we have the denouement. All the loose ends are tied up. Of course, Lady Macbeth has to die because she was the person who organised the murder. So for her part in King Duncan's murder, Shakespeare refuses to let her live. She becomes so full of guilt that she has nightmares and dreams, and in the end she kills herself off stage. We don't know how she does it. To make matters worse, the English army are arriving. Macbeth feels as if he's hemmed in, he's pressurised, he's trying to gather information, but he doesn't trust anybody, which is a complete contrast to King Duncan, who intelligence gathered in Act 1, Scene 2. Macbeth has complete mental breakdown, he's full of fear and denial, but ultimately he's still determined to protect his throne. So for that part, we can admire him. He goes to battle knowing the dangers that he faces, and one of those dangers is Macduff. And that was one of the witch's prophecies. Beware Macduff, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth, Macbeth is told. But of course, not everybody is born in the normal vaginal birth. Macduff was cut from his mother. He was untimely ripped, is the quote. And that means he was born of caesarean section. Maybe some of you were born by C-sections. So Macbeth can't deny it. This man is here to kill him. And Macbeth fights with bravery to the death, just like he did fight with bravery in that first battle we heard of in the opening act. Everything is restored back to its natural order. We have the rightful form of succession. So what that means is the King Duncan's son, Malcolm, takes over the throne as should be the case. And everybody lives happily ever after, except of course there's been a lot of death and bloodshed and false ambition throughout the whole play. So that's the main story. So you've heard me talk you through the main events of the story and how one idea might be connected to another. This is your chance to stop this video now, go on to Google Classroom, and you're going to complete the next task, which is to write your own summary of the play in your own words. So if you can just upload that onto Google Classroom, I'll give you some feedback. Thank you. So at this stage, you've heard all of the events that have taken place in the story. What I'd like to do is to write out the 7 main events in the order that they happen. And once you've chosen your 7, you don't have to have the right 7, you just have to have the 7 which are most important to you, that you feel you could write a little bit more about in an essay later on in this series. Once you've chosen those 7, you're then going to rank the events in order. So put the most important event at the top, the least important event at the bottom, and the one you think will probably is 50-50 in the middle, and from there you can work out the remainder of your order. The idea is you're looking at which of those events has the most impact on the characters and what happens elsewhere in the story. When you've gone through that process, you're then going to choose the 3 most symbolic moments. So in other words, if 3 of those events hadn't happened in this story, what impact would have been placed on the play? What are the three most important, relevant and symbolic moments that you think have made the characters change their minds or the events unravel in a completely different way? Okay, so I will give you one example. I think one of the most important events is when Macbeth chooses to return to the witches and they provide him with the three predictions for the future. First of all, we can see that they actually unfold, and secondly, the significant part is that Macbeth completely ignores all three, and it tells us quite a lot about that character, that he is so obsessed with his own power and ambition to retain his throne that he refuses to listen to anything, whether it comes from a positive source like his lords or his wife, or in this case from a negative source from the witches. How self-obsessive must he be at this stage? How far has he fallen from that great hero that we met in Act 1, Scene 2? So you can see that that has quite a significant impact on what happens at the end of the story. He ignores the prophecies and he goes straight into battle, obviously meeting his own death. And that's why really he's a tragic hero. So you're going to have a go at that yourself. Once you've done that, be ready to move on to the next part in the lesson. So now that we've thought about which events are more important than other events, and you personally have adopted a view on this, you're starting to think about your own interpretation of the plot, we're going to look at how events link from one to another. And as you can see, this image in front of you is taken from the London Underground. So I'd like to imagine that it's the tube map. And each one of these events is like a train station along the journey of the story. Look how they connect together. So here's a model, and in a moment you're going to go onto Google Classroom and you're going to devise your own links between the events that you've chosen. So the first event chosen here was the witches' predictions that Macbeth shall become Thane of Cawdor and king hereafter. Linked to that is Macbeth's gullibility. Now, if you're gullible, it means you believe what everyone says, without questioning. So if Macbeth hadn't been gullible, then he wouldn't have believed the witches' predictions, then he wouldn't have written the letter to Lady Macbeth sharing his ambitions about becoming king. That ambition probably would have just been a seed left in the back of his mind. Instead, it's watered by the witches' predictions and it grows into a murder plot. And Lady Macbeth has been drawn into the confidence of Macbeth, so she plots the murder for Macbeth, knowing that he is too full of the milk of human kindness to catch the nearest way himself. So she organises it for him. Now, without her committing that deed of murdering the murder plot, then Macbeth wouldn't have committed regicide. Now remember that regicide is a very specific crime. It's the murder of your king or your queen. So can you see how the witches' predictions, even if it is just for sheer fun and devilment, for mischief, has actually resulted in the murder of a good and honest king? So you're going to do your own now. So have a look on Google Classroom at the final task, and then you're going to submit those once you've done them. That's it for this week then. Okay, enjoy the work and ask me any questions if you're not quite clear or you need to make further progress. Thank you.